Hi, how's that sound-wise? Good? Okay, this is a big room. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This conference has a great reputation, and I'm honored to speak with all of you this morning. This talk, like everything, has a history. As Susan mentioned, my original training was as a historian, and I spent a lot of time in a history classroom. And so some of the origins of this talk come from that. It also comes from my first professional work for the Hopi tribe as an archivist and historian. And so you will see that in this talk as well. History seems to be the right, or one of the right boundaries, I think, of our context right now. It seems as though we are in a historical moment, and by that I mean not so much that this is the first time these things have ever happened, that they are unprecedented, but they are specific. And I don't think I'm alone in kind of feeling right now that the world is kind of fractured and ruptured. And again, in very specific ways. Just to give you an example, at my own campus right now, things are really supercharged. And we're having discussions, friendly and otherwise, about things like freedom of expression, safe spaces, and the purpose of a liberal education. And so this is the kind of specific context for this talk, and this is the exigence that I just wanted to place this talk in. It seems to me that information literacy practice and higher education more broadly, like I said, feels in a place of rupture right now. In conversations that I've been having with colleagues over the past year or two, I've been hearing a kind of yearning for a greater purpose and meaning, and wondering what we do right here, right now. So these are some of the questions that I've been hearing. Why isn't information literacy yet integrated across the curriculum in our institutions? We've been trying for a really long time. Why isn't this happening yet? It might be happening in some places, but that's a question that I've been hearing from a lot of people. Why are we still teaching mainly one-shots? Am I a bad librarian or information literacy program leader if that's all that I can be doing? What am I supposed to do with this new framework? Can you please teach me how to teach it? How can I resist the market discourse and materiality of the neoliberal university? And how do I do that and still help my students get the jobs they need to survive? And what about the larger world beyond my campus, the one in which truth seems to be post? What is the role of information literacy and higher education in survival and resistance? So these questions encompass the very specific and the very large. And one of the organizing principles of this talk is the idea of boundaries, space. Where do we locate the practice of our information literacy, or our practice of information literacy? How expansive should those boundaries be? Are there any boundaries that we need to cross? At what scale do we work? And so since this talk is kind of organized around scale, we're going to start really big and then move in a little bit closer. And so the first question that I ask is, what is the purpose of education, and what can information literacy bring to that larger purpose? So a couple of things before I dive into that. I just want to pay my debts up front in terms of my intellectual debts. So these are some of the people who have taught me and inspired me. Some of them will be referenced specifically in the talk, and some of them I just want to thank in terms of the conversations that I've been having with them over the past literally weeks, months, and years. But at the largest scale, my purpose can be found in this landscape. This is a picture of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And it can be found with these people. At this scale, the purpose of education is sovereignty, or more accurately, sovereignties in the plural. The fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline is taking place on the Standing Rock sovereign and traditional lands, and it is essentially about ways of knowing, valuing, ownership, and violence in a landscape that's been fractured by law, political economy, racism, and power. This image resonates with me in particular because I work in a library that sits on the occupied lands of the Hopi and Dene peoples. And because one of my institution's strategic goals is to contribute to an education that promotes the survival and well-being of those native sovereign nations. I'm sure that you have your own contexts that can produce similar images, other peoples, other fractured landscapes, where greater sovereignty is a worthy and noble goal for education and information literacy. And a caution, I know that sovereignty isn't an uncontested or simple word. At its most basic, it means the ability of persons and of peoples to control their own lives. But this term has also been borrowed by white supremacists, for example, in our history. And so I do use the word with some caution and care. I work in a state that is home to 21 federally recognized native sovereign nations, and like the Standing Rock Nation, sovereignty is central to their continued fight for survival. Sovereignty in the sense of having the power of self-determination is an essential goal, I think, of higher education. It is, in some reckoning, my information literacy learning outcome writ at the largest scale possible. And it's something that I hope that information literacy can contribute to. So education for sovereignty looks something like this. I took this photo last week. It's not the greatest photo, sorry, at the Art Gallery of Toronto in Ontario. It's a work by Bonnie Devine, an Anishinaabe artist titled Battle for the Woodlands. And in this work, Devine contextualizes Canadian history. She shows imposed political boundaries, fractures and refractures in this landscape. The beads that run through here represent treaty boundaries, all of which have been broken. The rivers are red like blood, and the Great Lakes are spirit animals to show the connection, the spiritual connection to water. Devine has redrawn a traditional colonial map in order to reintegrate the landscape and to tell what she calls a true history. She says, "This map really is a product of reading, thinking, and dreaming and imagining what it really means to live on these Great Lakes, what it means to have blood running inside your veins of these people who fought to protect these lakes, and what the lakes mean themselves. That's why I made them into animals, because they aren't just bodies of water. They are beings who are cohabitating with us in this space right now. They are living. We are in a relationship with them. We have been for many hundreds of years. That's why I wanted to gather these reeds and bring them here and show that there is a relationship." This gathering of reeds is, I would argue, a rebuilding of a fractured landscape. And it came from reading, thinking, dreaming, and imagining, all essential parts of education, and something to which I think information literacy can contribute. Sovereignty requires many things, so let's begin with the most basic, self. Sovereignty requires self-determination, which requires the agency of an autonomous actor. In her book, Self-Constitution, Agency, Identity, and Integrity, the philosopher Christine Korsgaard argues that constituting a unified self is the job of all humans. We become our specific selves by acting with our ends in mind, by choosing the effects we'd like to produce in the world. An intelligible action then embodies a principle or a reason. She writes, "Self-determination then requires identification with the principle of choice on which you act. Furthermore, you're not acting in isolation, but in public." To act is to insert yourself, your first-person deliberating self, into the causal network. The meanings of our actions are determined not just by what we mean by them, but by how the world takes them up. So this is not the vision of autonomous agents acting for utility or self-advancement. When we act, we are proposing public reasons or principles that require both an intentional movement and a representation or conception of the world. What I find compelling about Korsgaard's book is the idea of self-constitution as an active process of integrating multiple practical identities. We have identities that we are born into and those that we choose, such as profession, community, politics, family. And in prioritizing, harmonizing, and integrating those identities, we become a person through choosing our actions. Our incentives arise from these practical identities, from the roles and relationships that give our lives meaning and value. Korsgaard argues that it is no accident that we describe these processes as making up our minds, as pulling ourselves together. And this is at the core of sovereignty, a self that can and does act in the world creatively and hopefully in freedom. This is what makes us human and gives our action meaning and integrity. Borrowing from Korsgaard, then, education is an essential act of self-constitution. When our students describe their desire to make something of themselves, they are not necessarily talking about riches and fame and external measures of validation. They're in the process of pulling themselves together as autonomous actors in the world. Korsgaard argues that we must use intelligence and reason to reconstruct a picture of the world, a map, that enables us to find our way around in it, to decide where to go and what to do in that world. Furthermore, as Korsgaard suggests, when we make up our minds, we value our contingent practical identities. We value ourselves as human beings. We owe it to ourselves, she says, to our own humanity, to find some roles that we can fill with integrity and dedication. Helping students explore and inhabit such roles is a worthy outer boundary for education and information literacy. Sovereignty also requires material and social grounds. A fully constituted self is not enough for the enactment of self-determination. So first, the material. Here's where we encounter the difficult challenge of framing information literacy as more than workforce preparation. So we often talk about preparing engaged citizens, while also recognizing that employability is essential for our students' very survival. Some skirt the issue by suggesting that these are it's the exact same skills that you need for work and for citizenship, such as critical thinking, communication, and information literacy. On the surface, there's some truth to that, but I think the framing does matter. From my previous work, and as Susan mentioned, words matter a lot to me. The language that we use, the way that we frame things, shapes our actions. So the problem with just making these the same skills for citizenship and for employability is that it can flatten information literacy, once again, into generic skills that can be kind of used just anywhere, any place, any time, and that those skills can then become, again, kind of flat and seen as neutral. Karen Nicholson argues that we need to frame our critique of neoliberalism in higher education in a manner that acknowledges the socioeconomic and political realities of our campuses and lobbies for change at the same time. Tressie McMillan Cottom argues that we do this at the same time work by taking our students seriously and understanding the systemic roots of credentialism in both higher and what she calls lower ed. In her book of the same name, how many people have read that or is anybody familiar? I highly recommend it. It's one of the best things that I've read about higher education in probably a decade or so. It's very powerful. Lower ed. And so in her book, she describes the lasting power of the education gospel, of the faith in the individual work ethic and self-determination and self-sacrifice. If students work hard and gain an education represented by the credential, they will be rewarded with a good job and security. For the most vulnerable, this credential, again, we have to take this seriously, is absolutely essential. And it is or was the social contract embodied in the education gospel. The problem, she says, is that college education through public disinvestment and the privatization of finance and risk, mainly through student loans, is now an individual rather than a public good. But the faith in the gospel, in the idea that higher education is inherently good and moral, still holds sway as an idea, if not a reality. So Cottom writes, the gospel was critical to higher education's shift to its vocational promise. That is, the idea that higher education is a moral good is allowable only insofar as higher education serves market interests. Education is good because a good job is good. The faith breaks down when we divorce higher education from jobs. The contradiction is that we don't like to talk about higher education in terms of jobs, but rather in terms of citizenship and the public good, even when that isn't the basis of our faith. What I find valuable in Cottom's work is her approach to student agency and motivation. Students are making rational choices. She does not fault the students in her study, and she's studying for-profit colleges. And so she's not saying that they're duped for being in these institutions that are in many ways our system taking advantage of them. Because they're seeking credentials as a form of personal and economic advancement. She takes that seriously. And she writes, the students I spoke with wanted the credentials so that they could keep the promised social contract of the post-industrial economy, the contract of guaranteed employment, dignified work, and health and retirement benefits. She argues that we should respect for and fight for students' fundamental need for an education that provides these promises of the social contract. They are indeed essential to sovereignty. And while the fraying of the social contract of education as a public good might be larger than something that we can solve in this room together today, I think that we can still act within the purpose and values of that social contract. So a colleague at NAU told me this story about, there was a student panel on general education. And one of the complaints that students had was that nobody was telling them why this course was meaningful, what it meant to them, what it meant to their education. And they you know, this is a classic statement, they said, and we're paying for this, so we need to know. And Cottom's work really helped me kind of work through, I have an initial reaction to that is like, oh, that's the student as customer in an entitled way. But in fact, that rather than that, you know, student as customer, what they were talking about was risk. The students were taking all of the risks in our current situation. They were taking on loads of debt. They weren't saying, you know, because this is costing me X in tuition. They said, this is costing me a lot in debt that is going to be with me for the rest of my life, seemingly in some cases. They simply wanted to know what they were taking those risks for. So at the very least, I think that we need to meet our students take them seriously as actors within this context of the social contract. We need to tell them what we're providing as a part of that. We need to make our case for liberal education explicit and showing them that yes, it has individual and benefits for the public good. We can be honest with them about where the social contract is broken. And we, especially in libraries, can still provide public goods through our collections, our spaces, our services that might mitigate some of our individual students' risk. And we can fight for a better social contract. Cottom argues that systemic problems require political solutions. She writes, and I quote, "If we have a shitty credentialing system in the case of for-profit colleges, then it is likely because we have a shitty labor market. To be more precise, we have a labor market where the social contract between workers and the work on which colleges previously relied has fundamentally changed and makes workers more vulnerable. Cottom argues for multi-pronged political approaches and social movements that tackles issues like wealth inequality, underfunded and unequal K-12 schools, and labor market discrimination, among other things. This is the at-the-same-time work that Nicholson calls for. We can help our students attain knowledge, skills, and credentials that might shield them from some of the effects of social inequality and some of the risk that they're taking on. We can provide material grounds for their self-determination. We can also do political work ourselves. And through our information literacy, contribute to students' knowledge, skills, and social grounds to do their political work to improve the social contract. I would argue that many of you work for institutions who are already doing this at the same work all the time and have this framing just right, I think. And that's those of you in community colleges. So again, my thanks and hats off to you. And people in four-year institutions like myself need to learn more from you, and I look forward to that today. And so, in essence, what I'm saying is that we can promote the goal of sovereignty, not just in our classrooms and in our curricula, but through our whole professional and personal selves and political selves. The fight for education as a public good for a robust social contract is essential for sovereignty. We must constitute ourselves as self-determined individuals, but we act on public grounds. When we act as fully constituted individuals, we're projecting public reasons and principles for our actions. To repeat Korsgaard, the meaning of our actions are determined not just by what we mean by them, but by the way the world takes them up. This requires a public and democratic space that acknowledges that we have not, and still do not, take up the actions and meanings of all people equally. The conception of the world as represented in Devine's map is not neutral and ahistorical. History, and really all forms of knowledge, create and erase whole peoples. History is written by people, about certain people, and not others, with all the distorting power that selection entails. When Devine created her map, she was rewriting the Anishinaabe back into history, and thereby creating sovereign claims for her people as a people. She was depicting the landscape of knowledge as contested, militarized, and marked by competing definitions of value and values. Through this act, she was reclaiming the rights of her people to exist and have a voice in the public sphere. Libraries can be places for and provide tools for this kind of work, this kind of reclamation. Too often, our systems flatten these contested and competing landscapes, making knowledge appear equal, the same, and neutral. Our databases serve up decontextualized bits and atoms. Our book stacks convey that all of these things are the same. They look very uniform. Our very spaces sometimes convey the idea that knowledge is fixed. We talk about the need for diverse viewpoints and welcoming all ideas as if our buildings and our values and our people will do that automatically for all people at all times. We hide the true history of knowledge from our students, and this in turn diminishes a robust public ground, for the neutral always privileges the powerful and those marked as normal. A commitment to the goal of sovereignty, then, requires that we not just collect more diverse books and provide equal time for competing viewpoints in neutral spaces. Rather, we can and should play an active role in marking the situated, contested, and plural nature of knowledge in our libraries and classrooms, in showing how power works, how systems work. Because a democratic public ground must be actively and critically made and remade every day. We must also remember that some people have easier routes to sovereignty as a given than others. As Cottom suggests, ignoring systemic inequalities in the workings of power can obscure the erosion of public goods and the social contract. And we cannot be sovereign as persons or peoples without this democratic ground. So that's the big boundary, large. So what do we do? If the most extensive boundary of our landscape is this goal of sovereignty, what actions can we take or not take at a local scale? So I'm going to move the boundaries in a bit. What are the possible boundaries of our information literacy practice? Devine describes her map as a true history, and this is a good reminder that history often repeats itself. So the questions and concerns about the future of information literacy, the framework, neoliberalism, are specific but not necessarily new. Much of higher education, for example, especially after World War II, has always been about jobs. So this is not necessarily a new purpose or a new discourse. Information literacy was born in response to a perceived crisis, that of an educational system at risk of producing students with the skills for the information economy or the knowledge economy. And that was in the 1980s. This was, in some ways, a long time ago and not so long ago, depending on your perspective. And it seems like we're facing another kind of crisis right now. And as we work within this context, I ask you to watch for history repeating itself, or more specifically, to watch for ourselves repeating our own history. And from this, I draw on the work of Kevin Kumashiro, who is a faculty in, he does teacher education, College of Education faculty. And he argues that our best critical and anti-oppressive efforts in our teaching are often limited by what he calls repetitions. Repetitions come from individual and collective expectations about what education looks like. We repeat kind of unquestioned and unexamined assumptions and practices as teachers, and our students desire to see what they expect an education to be. They have their expectations of what learning looks like, and that we need to take those things into account. Kumashiro writes, learning in anti-oppressive ways involves unlearning or questioning what students already know. By implication, desiring to learn involves resisting repetition, especially the repetition of what students believe they are supposed to be learning. He argues that these repetitions aren't necessarily always bad, like our assumptions aren't always necessarily wrong, and that a lot of these repetitions are useful and comforting, but they can sometimes be harmful. He uses Frere's banking model, for example, of a repetition that we often repeat. So in the banking model, it's the idea that the teacher's role is to fill up the heads of our students, to deposit knowledge in them, and that most of us in this room probably don't necessarily agree with that model of education, and yet we often use it in our own practice. And so we want students to be able to repeat back theories and ideas correctly. We want them to apply knowledge appropriately. We want them to write essays properly, to cite citations perfectly. And that these are all repetitions of the banking model that you see even if we don't buy into that model and think that that model is not very productive. He says that those goals are worthwhile. Again, it's about watching for repetitions, not necessarily throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Since the ability to demonstrate accepted knowledge and have these marketable skills is important capital, especially in this context of risk. However, he argues, it is problematic when educators presume to know exactly what the student is to learn, to foretell this learning with a list of standards, and structure education accordingly. Presuming to know and control what students are to learn makes possible only certain kinds of changes and closes off the infinite changes yet to be imagined. This presumption is especially problematic when recognizing that all knowledge is partial. Even so-called anti-oppressive and educational knowledge and practices are necessarily limited. So Kumashiro suggests that we still have to plan our lessons, to have learning goals, to do assessment, but he argues to keep in mind that education doesn't consist solely of rational, predictable, controllable processes. There is a space between teacher and the teaching, between learner and the learning, that we should take up the liberatory potential of that space by refusing to foretell what students, or who students are and what they might become. In this way, students are invited to explore many possible ways of learning and being, in his words. So if Devine's map was built from dreaming and imagining, then perhaps we should include those possibilities in our approach to information literacy and learning. This allows students their agency, their sovereignty, and their freedom to not be limited by our partial imaginations or the foretelling of the teacher. Kumashiro concludes, teaching is not about repeating the status quo or utopian visions that are themselves partial. Educators cannot presume to know who their students are, what they need, and whether they have changed in desired ways as a result of their lesson. Such a process will likely require teachers to unlearn their ideas of good teaching. So let's unlearn a little bit. How can we presume not to know who our students are, what they need in terms of learning outcomes, and whether they've changed as a result of our work through assessment? These aren't easy questions, but I think that they're worth asking and kind of resisting our urge for that repetition in the answer. And so I would just ask that we kind of let go of the concern about, like, what do you mean you're telling me I've got to, I don't need learning outcomes anymore? But I'd like to live within that space, kind of imagining that for a little while, what that might look like. My big question, for this is, how do we take a map like this, a curriculum map, and turn it into a map like this? And one of the things that we can do, and here I'm drawing on the work of Anne-Marie Lloyd, and she argues for a reconceptualization of information literacy itself, the very definition of it. She argues that a landscape metaphor provides a more productive definition of information literacy than one based on generic skills, for example. Information literacy, in her view, should be defined as the ability to know what's in a landscape and to draw meaning from it through actual engagement and experiences with information in a landscape. And that landscape can be a workplace, an academic discipline, politics, areas of your personal life. They're infinite. So information literacy, in her view, is the process of learning an information landscape, its sources of information, the social processes that give value to that information in that particular context, and the barriers that inhibit access and understanding. In this view, information literacy is not something that is learned, assessed, and over, but something that we constantly engage in to understand different landscapes in the different contexts of our lives. Lloyd's most recent work is on information and refugees in Sweden, who she describes as experiencing a fractured landscape. She describes the process of transition of refugees who have to reconcile their established ways of knowing and practices with information to their receiving countries. And while I know that there are real dangers in kind of taking a metaphor from one context and moving it into another, I think this metaphor of the fractured landscape has great resonance for me in this moment right now, and specifically in the context of sovereignty. Indeed, Devine's map is a fractured landscape that has been restitched together and reconciled in some way. And many of our students experience these and other types of fractures. So Lloyd asks, what happens when an information landscape becomes fractured? How do people experience the process of fracture? How do they rebuild the landscape? Lloyd's work also engages the ideas from Korsgaard's idea of self-constitution. Just as we make something of ourselves by acting and thereby finding our way in the world, we become information literate in a landscape by finding our way around in it, deciding where to go and what to do, what actions to take. So information literacy conceived in this way might help our students develop useful conceptions of the world in which to choose actions as self-determined people. There is no foretelling who students are or where they might go, but that doesn't mean that information literacy has no goal or purpose or structure. But this kind of thinking requires us to unlearn a couple of specific things. So first, let's explore the repetition related to learning outcomes and assessment. One of the ways to unlearn this might be to interrogate the idea of the linear curriculum. This idea posits that students should and can and will experience a sequenced information literacy or other curriculum in a unidirectional way. It all goes the one way. So foundations are established in introductory courses, and then you build more complex experiences on top of that in further courses, all ending with a capstone. Many colleges and universities, including my own, are working on creating more intentional pathways through the curriculum so that students can move more efficiently. And given what I said earlier about students and risk, I'm not criticizing that purpose of efficiency in any way. If they're taking on risk, I actually think that that is our responsibility. But efficiency alone isn't a reason for this kind of linear curricular approach. And part of that is it doesn't match the reality of our students' lives in many cases. They don't actually move through the curriculum in straight lines. And again, there are material reasons for that. Because our universities haven't necessarily invested in the faculty that are required to provide those options in the pathway all at the same time. I was talking earlier at NAU, they have to hold biology labs right now on Saturdays because they literally don't have enough space for the students. So there are these bottlenecks that exist within our linear curriculums. Furthermore, the types of students who can take advantage of that kind of perfectly sequenced curriculum aren't the majority in our institutions. Especially, this is difficult when people have work responsibilities, family responsibilities that literally restrict when they can take classes and how often. And so, again, those are some practical reasons why the linear curriculum might be something to strive for and ideal, but it's really not the reality for many of us. But still, librarians, including my past self, have advocated for a sequenced approach to information literacy. We've mapped the curriculum to identify these linear pathways that are efficient and to provide a meaningful kind of scope and sequence where we lay the foundation and build. In some institutions and individual programs, that affords a structure for powerful learning, and I have seen it work, and I've also seen it not work in others. But aside from this practical problem of whether you could move students through a linear curriculum, it might just be too limited or rather kind of specific pedagogically. If we conceive of information literacy as moving through a landscape, of learning a landscape, the linear approach leaves a lot out. It channels in one direction, and it foretells. It also places the locus of teaching and learning on specific content rather than placing the students as the locus of teaching and learning. So if we frame our work as teaching students rather than teaching students information literacy, or teaching information literacy to students, we center them as actors in the landscape rather than making our concept and curricula the object of our attention. And if you think about the way that most curriculum maps look, it's content moving through the curriculum, not students, in the way that we represent that. So what if we begin with students at the center of a larger web of connections with multiple pathways and multiple nodes, and not worry so much about whether this course or this session, this one-shot, is the right or wrong place for information literacy. That in fact, I would argue, we can make connections with students wherever we meet them in the landscape, wherever we happen to be with them. And again, this isn't to argue to give up the curriculum as one locus of our efforts, or to abandon the attempt to reach students in those places where we think will have the most impact. Nor does it mean abandoning the idea that information literacy is developmental and requires time. Instead, I just argued that the curriculum is only one place, and that we need to return to the richness of Divine's map to meet our students in multiple places in this geography, to connect where we can, and to connect across different dimensions. In practical terms, this might mean taking advantage of those faculty who are willing to provide us the space and that connected place with students, and to take all of those opportunities seriously. We shouldn't limit our efforts to just those places that seem to fit some better path or sequence. So embeddedness over the entire course of a curriculum is not necessarily the ideal and only model for our practice. I would urge all of you to use the one-shot. Make connections where you can. Draw out, when you're there with them, some features of the landscape that will help your users or your learners become more well-informed. If formal curricular opportunities are limited, look to the co-curriculum, to student groups and activities, that these are also places where students are constituting themselves and where we can make connections. So once we've decided where we are on the map with our students, what do we do there? If we think of our roles as connecting nodes and providing context in an information landscape rather than traveling on one linear path, how do we make and help students make those connections? This is where I think the framework, specifically being used as a framework of concepts, can be useful. But again, we have to pay attention to the possible repetitions. In talking with people over the past couple of years about the framework, I've heard a lot of questions, and the concerns that bubble up are related to questions like, again, how do we get learning outcomes out of this? Are these learning outcomes? And I've seen attempts to map the standards to the framework, to use the language in the framework literally as learning outcomes, and to assess the framework kind of wholesale. And I would just urge you that this is kind of an approach that we might want to resist. And one way to do that might be to set our boundary for the framework, not as the framework as a whole, but at the individual concept level. So last week, I had the great pleasure to work with a bunch of librarians in Toronto and Guelph in Canada. And we actually worked through the framework, again, not starting at the whole thing and working our way down, but we spent some time working with individual concepts, and you can see one here. We actually worked at the sentence level. And we actually took individual sentence out of the context of the framework, plopped those sentences down in the middle of tables, and that's what we worked with, these individual sentences. We asked the questions, what might our students do with a concept like this? What might it enable them to do within a particular information landscape? What might they use this, I'm thinking about them as tools for learning that they carry around with them. How might these concepts act as orienting objects to help students understand and better navigate a landscape? So what I propose here is that we not think of the concept or framework as existing at a single kind of boundary or threshold that we have to cross over, but that these concepts can exist at nodes and boundaries within and between information landscapes. And here I draw on the work related to boundary objects, which are defined as information, such as a map, that are used across different communities. They're objects that are plastic enough to adapt to one place and to be used in another community, yet they're robust enough to maintain a common identity across sites. These tools, boundary objects, can be abstract or concrete, and the creation and management of boundary objects is a key in developing and maintaining coherence across intersecting worlds. And so this work originally comes from Starr and Griesemer on boundary objects. So the concepts in the framework themselves are not learning outcomes or even the source of all of our learning outcomes potentially, but tools and boundary objects that we might provide to students to further their learning of a landscape. And last week specifically, again, I was working with librarians at the University of Guelph, and they provided, I think, a useful concrete example. And it really helped shape my thinking, so I thank them. We were exploring, again, at the sentence level or at the concept level, how to use these concepts to inform some really basic things in their practice that all of them teach, like keywords. And so the idea that they currently teach is that you need to understand the specific vocabulary of a database or a search tool in order to search effectively. But through this work, we realized that they might attach that skill that seems really narrow within a really confined boundary to a larger concept in the framework and some of the other critical discourse that they were grappling with as teachers. And so they decided that they were going to connect that really practical skill in the many different contexts and one-shots where they happen to be kind of deploying that, to connect it to the idea that language is situated and contested and has great power to kind of set and police the norms in a discipline or socially more broadly. So even in a one-shot, keywords and searching, they can use this larger concept to help students see the individual words they are using when they're finding information, when they're searching information, to understand that knowledge, again, is created actively, to show that process of how it's shared and contested and policed in their larger social worlds. The last repetition that I'd like to call attention to is related to how we conceive of our students, specifically within the discourse of the framework. The framework describes novice and expert practices, and that novice-expert thing, I think, reinforces the idea of students moving along a linear path. And Kumashiro describes that as the conception of students going from ignorance to enlightenment. A landscape approach can help interrupt this idea. Even if we assume that our students aren't empty vessels and that they bring a lot of knowledge with them and experience to their learning, the linear approach does have a fixed end. And it constrains the idea of placing our students at the center rather than our content. It limits imagination, as Kumashiro suggests, making possible only certain kinds of changes and closes off the infinite changes yet to be imagined. So he proposes instead that we approach our teaching with the expectation that students have various types of knowledge and expect them to both learn and unlearn various perspectives. And this better matches the idea of meeting students where they are in multiple places on the map and learning and unlearning various perspectives with them. So I know the embracing the uncertainty of not foretelling, of not, guiding everything in terms of these outcomes that we can define, of like plopping ourselves down with students in the middle of this landscape has some serious limits. We do need to have clear learning goals to communicate to our students, to focus our learning, to focus our attention on what we want to teach, especially if we only have brief moments with them in the landscape. We have to make it purposeful. We have to make it count. We need to listen to students in order to assess what they're learning, how they're learning, in order that we can improve and make deeper and more lasting connections with them in the landscape. And I know that it is hard to kind of reconcile that, kind of not foretelling this kind of openness of the landscape with our fractured landscape that pulls between the instrumentality of learning outcomes and assessment, measures of success based on things like retention and graduation rates, of the pressures to prove our value. But I think that we have more room to maneuver than we might imagine. And that we have the power of imagination and dreaming, and we have the power of politics. If we do not think our curriculum should be linear and overdetermined and fixed, we can choose to act in that way, at least at some scale in our local landscapes of practice. For we, like our students, are engaged in a process of self-constitution as sovereign human beings. We can act even in one location in our landscape, a one-shot, a co-curricular event, and project our reasons and principles into the larger public world. We can, to return to Korsgaard, make up our own minds, pull ourselves together, and insert our first-person deliberating selves into the causal network. This might be political work to restore a more robust social contract. And it might be making just one important connection to a larger world in a one-shot. In all of these cases, we can use, to use Divine's phrase, we can gather the reeds and we can bring them to where our students are and thereby make connections that help reconcile our practice and build a stronger common ground. Thank you. So there's some time for questions before some more deliberate discussion of some of the questions that might have just raised for you.
Thank you for the concept of a landscape. I like that a lot. I'm really intrigued by the work you were describing at the University of Guelph, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that context of the keyword search and the broader use of language, because I work with students who represent typical age college kids, immigrants who are doing academic work at the college level in a language that's not their own. And I frequently talk about use of language and understanding how different synonyms can produce different search results. Tell me a little more about how they went from concept to how can I use this in my actual teaching and interactions with students?
So we didn't get that far. It was a day workshop, kind of 2 days over time. And so a couple of things. One, but some practical things, because again, they were teaching the same thing across different settings in different disciplines, where some of them were very much, kind of embedded and could kind of see students many times, and others really had one opportunity. And so the key insight from that idea was to always connect in the sense of, okay, I've been asked to teach. I need to teach these students how to search these tools effectively. But the words that I use, the examples that I use, and the framing that I put around it is not the, I'm going to teach you to search this really effectively. The framing is, we have to understand the language that people are using in this discipline, and to understand they might not always use the same things and why, to set things up. Because what you want with this idea, and the framework affords this, I think, in the sense of building on a lot of the understanding by design work, in the sense of we can get students to, do the kind of the rote and the routine of like checking the subject headings and looking at the controlled vocabulary. But if they don't have some deeper understanding to attach that to, that's just this kind of automatic algorithm as opposed to deeper learning. And so where we ended up, and like, sorry I don't have anything, but maybe that's something to talk about during the hour discussion of this. But they decided to pay more attention to their framing and to not be afraid to frame things with some really big concepts, you know, that knowledge isn't neutral, and it's created by people, and that have all kinds of politics involved, and it changes over time and in different contexts. And understanding that, yes, it might help you find those 5 peer-reviewed articles faster, but boy, it might also help you understand, why are they using those words? You know, why does that vocabulary matter? Why those choices? Because then they can take that either to another discipline, so that they can understand, oh, there's these things like disciplinary expertise and norms that I'm going to have to learn to negotiate. And it can also connect them, even with that assignment, it can make that skill just more kind of deeply embedded, resonant, and again, a tool that they can use in ways that again, we might not know or imagine. And we might not ever be able to measure that. So I think the most practical thing is to, you know, always think about the framing, in which the context in which you're placing something, even as specific as keyword searching. Does that help? Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. I appreciated the way you spoke about the web of connections and finding different methodologies for students to move through a curriculum. I'm about to work on a library publishing curriculum, and this is grounding my question. So we, I think, are thinking about it the right way because we're thinking about multiple pathways through the curriculum. But my question is, in designing the curriculum, how do you know what those pathways might look like? Because I think we're trying to anticipate those pathways. And I think that, to me, is the hardest part, because you're saying, you don't know where your student's coming from, and I don't. These students are going to be so varied and so various and have different goals. So I guess, and there may not be an answer, but I just thought I'd put that out there.
Yeah, and again, you know, these are the kinds of questions that I'm hoping that the discussion takes up in terms of how to deal, you know, how do you, you know, if your big goals are these kind of, you know, we want them to be, you know, self-determined people, and then how do you do that in something that is, you know, kind of confined, and when there is all of that unpredictability. And I think the kind of initial response to that is, again, going back to kind of the concept, the idea that students can, no matter where they're coming from, so if they're not, I mean, if they're going through, if you can anticipate, like, just, I mean, I think curriculum mapping can be useful just in knowing, like, where am I going to see the most students? You know, what's the point in the curriculum that they all have to pass through so I can do something? I think that has a lot of value. And so, you know, looking at that kind of program and that kind of curriculum map, I think, is important. But the other thing, and not necessarily but the power of the concepts, and I'm not advocating for any particular concept in the framework. We're doing some work at my own campus where we're using it, not using it, adding, taking away, which is what I think the intention of a framework is. But the idea that, oh, if you've got a student who has, you know, they've been in all of these introductory courses, they've heard this before, but oh, I've got these students who haven't, or they haven't had these experiences in their lives or their educations, or they're bringing something to it. You can approach those concepts from multiple directions. Again, if you make that the locus of your attention, and so that students, again, can kind of pick those up and use them in different ways with different levels of experience. And so you might still be kind of teaching some practical things that some people might know and some people might not, and you can still do that. But you're all engaged with that concept and why it matters, and maybe how it connects to something else, to the next course, to an internship that they're doing, you know, in this program, or to something in their lives. So again, to focus it at that concept level.
Wendy, to your right. Over.
Thanks. I feel bad. I've kind of ignored this part of the room.
First, is this on? Yes, okay. First, I want to thank you for, I thought, one of the better arguments for the framework that I've heard. So I thought that was very practical in a lot of ways. But second, at the very end, you talked about the co-curricular experience being part of where the students are self-constituting. And I like the idea of us as professionals self-constituting and choosing to be there as well. But I was wondering if you had any sort of examples in this sort of landscape framework where we might interact in the co-curricular sphere, like what might those choices look like?
Right. So a couple of things. I need to give credit to the librarians at the University of Guelph because one of the things that they've been working through the framework quite a bit, and I was really privileged that they invited me to spend again a day kind of working very practically with them. And one of the things that they decided, again, it's that tension between, oh my God, I want to help produce these sovereign, powerful political beings. Yet at the same time, I've got to teach keywords. And reconciling those frames is difficult. And I really appreciated, they've been working a lot with with Mandy Lupton and Christine Bruce's, they're called the jest windows. So this is another thing I'd recommend. It's not in the list of sources here. I'll leave that up so you can take a look, and I'll send any recommendations that you want. But this is the idea that there's a kind of a generic view or window on information literacy, kind of the skills-based approach that we're used to. A situated one, and that's more the landscape mode of you got to understand your situation and the context and what the sources of information and the values are in that landscape. And then there's the transformative window, which is like we need to go out there and change the world. And they were trying to, for a while, well, how do we create a transformative curriculum and teach keywords? And so they said, we just made a decision that we're going to kind of approach our curricular opportunities in a situated way, and the transformative work will happen outside of the curriculum in these co-curricular spaces. So again, working with student I don't have kind of specifics necessarily from what they're doing and don't want to speak for them, but to give you an example of something that we just did on my campus was there's been a huge debate, like I said, over safe spaces. We've had issues with faculty members being targeted and harassed. It's made Sean Hannity. To give you an example, part of this talk, part of the exigence of this, comes from I check my social media every morning because of this event that we had on from safe spaces to brave spaces. And it was librarians and faculty, and again, I was bringing, and other librarians were bringing this perspective of what the values of the library are in terms of safe spaces, of brave spaces, of free expression, and that wasn't tied to any particular part of the curriculum. But with some programming that we did in the moment that we thought might add value and connects to these larger concepts that we're trying to communicate. So that's an example, again, through programming, we've got a lot of librarians who are working with individual kind of groups and clubs. And again, some of it is to prepare them for in really practical ways. This is how a librarian can help you succeed in this particular career. So that, I don't know if that helps or not, but kind of gives you both that decision point that you make in terms of, I'm not going to be able to achieve all my goals in the curriculum, so let's look and see what other opportunities are.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Any talk that brings together Cottam and Lloyd in one thing is very interesting. One of your concepts that really raised thoughts for me was the idea of, the goal of education is creating sovereign, self-constituting individuals, and when you do that, they might not act in the ways that you intended them to act. Mm-hmm. So it's a broad question about, have you thought about this disjunction, or do you have thoughts about that? But some specific things to hang that on. I was thinking about the incident that the question that we hear a lot is like, why do I have to learn this?
Right.
I'm guessing that many of us in this room have like an investment in like, education it's an end in itself, and you should just want to do it because, and students, for very good reasons, wanting credentials, or I want to teach them like, how does a historian think? And orienting them to that information literacy landscape, but they have their own pathways and goals. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
One is, I gave up a long time ago in wanting to try to predict where my students might go. I just don't know, and in the sense of, who they're going to become, what they're going to do with this particular knowledge. As far as the wanting the credential and the, why does this, I want them to see that they might be able to do something with that credential, or to use this knowledge in ways that isn't necessarily that instrumental, but might be instrumental in other ways. I'm not sure I have a particularly good answer to that, other than a little bit of just kind of letting go and trying to set my own intention. And again, to try to connect, even if they don't, and this is, as with all education, I know that there were things like 10, 15 years after I left a class that it was like, oh, that's why that was important. I had no idea at the time. And to try to plant that seed into students, I think to ask them, another thing is, how might you use this? What are other settings where this concept, where you've seen this in action, where this might be a powerful explanation to help you develop that concept of the world? Because one of the things that I think is really hard for students is that idea that, knowledge is made and remade all the time. So tying it to larger social questions, political questions, and that doesn't necessarily mean getting into partisan politics. When I talk about politics, I'm talking about politics in many ways with a small p. But bringing that, putting that tool in their hands of some of those ideas that might help them connect, and then asking them, having them play with it for a while. What can you do this? What does this help you do in your class? That's an assessment question. What did this help you do in terms of your assignment? And projecting forward, what might you do with it? Because, again, I don't know that we've imagined all the possibilities, and I don't think we should try to foreclose that. Set. Okay, and then I know that we wanted a little time for people to walk around and get coffee before we reconstitute ourselves at tables to pick some of this up.
Thanks, and thank you for all of this. One of the questions I have is thinking about how we're able to reach so many students at once when we talk to a class and students have a compelling reason to come to that class. Their professor has brought them there, to the library, mm-hmm. We've gone to them. But are you aware of any discussions like this happening around the teaching that we do one-on-one at our research help desks? I just think about in the efforts to boost efficiency and not have librarians just sitting there waiting for questions, we've lost our place in that landscape. Mm-hmm.
So do I have, I'm going to make sure I understand the question. Do I have ideas for?
Yeah, do you have any ideas, or have you heard any discussions about how to apply things like this in the framework, or are people talking about it in terms of the teaching they're doing one-on-one at our research help desks?
So I haven't necessarily heard of anything specifically other than the idea that if that's what you have, use it. If that's where you're meeting students, I have heard it in the context, and we're rethinking reference at my own institution, and making sure, in part that when we can, to make those encounters teaching encounters, and to use the same consistent language, knowing that sometimes those reference encounters are very transactional, and it's hard to say, like, whoa, I know you need this like in an hour, for this assignment, or even with faculty, I know, like the grant application is due in 5 minutes, and you really need this. But again, using similar language, pointing out when, we're in a reference situation and, in a nursing, database, and, pay attention to the language. Why do you think this language is being used here? How is understanding this language going to help you search? And to be very kind of explicit about that. And again, it's be with the students where you can, and be very intentional about what you're doing with students there when you can. Okay. Well, thank you. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Hi, I'm Jill King, a librarian at DePaul University and an organizer of this year's summit. I'd like to thank Wendy Holliday for this really powerful and engaging talk that she joined us to share today. I know I appreciate the chance to think about our professional work within within these social and political realities. So thank you. We have a small token of our appreciation to share with you.
Thank you very much.